Welcome to Search Funded, the Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition podcast. I'm your host, Nick Law, and today's episode is one that I've been really looking forward to. A lot of the conversations that we've had on this podcast thus far are about doing search in markets that are already pretty well defined, like the US or Western Europe, where there's already a clear playbook built. But today's episode is about what it looks like to do search where that playbook really doesn't exist. Sally Tian is someone who grew up between China and Canada, worked in consulting and tech, including at ByteDance most recently, and then went to Harvard Business School. And instead of following the traditional post-MBA path that many international students do, she decided to move back to China and start a search fund with her husband and co-founder Liam. What's really interesting about her story is not just the geographic shift, but also the personal one, turning away from what she's described as the immigrant dream and choosing a path that's a lot less defined, but potentially a lot more aligned with who she is. So in this conversation, we're going to talk about what it's been like for her helping build the search fund ecosystem in China from scratch, as she is one of the very first searchers there, how sourcing and financing there differ from the US, and what it takes to build credibility as a young operator in a very relationship driven market. Sally, welcome to the show. Really happy to have you on. So,
Excited to be here.
yeah, really excited for the conversation. I think maybe just so everyone can get acquainted with you and your thinking, why don't you tell us how you and Liam decided to do the search fund together? I know it's not a necessarily typical path that either of you maybe would have thought of before business school. So would love to learn how that conversation first went and how you two decided that you're going to do this together.
Yeah, I think it's a two-part question in that how did we decide to do it together and why did we decide to do search? So I think the best way to answer is maybe just chronologically. I mean, Liam and I kind of met um, 3 years before we went to HBS, and we kind of went through a lot together. We were dating in China, trying to figure out working in China, and then we were locked down in COVID together in Shanghai, and that was just a period for us to reflect on what's next in our career. And we both decided maybe applying to the B school and kind of taking a step back and think about what's next would be best. And very luckily, both of us got into HBS. And I had always thought the next step for me after B school would be entrepreneurship. It was just at that point in my career where I feel like I tried out everything. And so I was just really trying to figure out how I could leverage HBS as a platform to do something on my own. And yeah, very luckily discovered the search fund model and learned more about it and got to kind of test out whether or not it would work in China. And it just became more and more apparent to me that, yeah, this is something that could work. And then right around like graduation, it was kind of like a light bulb that clicked in both of our heads that we could actually do this together. And, a paired team is better than one. And we really have a complementary skill set that we can leverage to build this out. So yeah, I kind of just slowly convinced Liam, and then we both decided to kind of jump in together and decided to do this.
I mean, it's great that you had the professional complementary skill sets as well as clearly also being aligned in other ways. A lot of times people talk about business partnership like a marriage. And so if you're already married, it's probably even better working with that person. I guess one thing I wanted to dive deeper into a little bit is that you mentioned that you tried a few different things, and after being in tech, after being a consultant, you knew that entrepreneurship is what you wanted to do. Maybe you could go a little bit deeper into what attracted you to entrepreneurship and why you knew that the corporate path wasn't for you.
Yeah, I think maybe the reason, if I were to really think about it, is I'm just a very creative person, and I tend to be really a first principles thinker. So I tend to approach life and looking at just any situation as I try to figure out what the root cause is, and if there's a fundamental problem, and if it's systematic, then it's hard to solve. But if it's a problem that has a solution, I try to just solve it. But when you're stuck in a corporate or like a large organization, there's people, right? And with people, there's politics. And I feel like just navigating that is really tiring for me. So like if I were to think back, like my favorite memory in consulting was one of my first few projects. And everyone loves the cool, shiny strategy project, but my favorite one was like I worked at this Canadian footwear brand, and they were really small. They were like maybe 10, $15 million in revenue. And because it was so small, I got to work a lot with the founder and the CEO. And they were having trouble figuring out how to sell their dead stock. Like there were just a lot of shoes that were out of season, and their sales team just didn't want to sell them because it's hard to sell. And I kind of just looked at them and I said, "Have you guys ever tried building out a tiered sales incentive plan where you incentivize them based on the SKUs that you want to sell?" And I remember the founder, his eyes just widened, and he looked at me and said, "That's genius! Like, how did you think of that?" Yeah, so I love moments like that where I feel like you feel like really close to a problem and you feel like you can just implement something and see if the experiment works. And I think just throughout my time working, I try to get closer and closer to the problem where eventually I realized if I just want to do that, I should just take the leap of faith and bear the risk and try to do it on my own. And it was definitely scary at first, but I feel like it's really worth it after I've taken the leap of faith.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really happy for you that you are on what seems to be the right path for you. And I think that is what attracts a lot of the people who are good at entrepreneurship and who like it to it, is that your performance is what you're judged for and your innovation is what you're judged for. It's not so much are you good at
Exactly.
playing politics, which unfortunately that is a big part of the job in the corporate world. You also written a lot about how you sort of had the immigrant dream. You came to Canada and there was that path that was laid out for you that's laid out for a lot of people in that position. And that's not the path that you necessarily ultimately wanted. So not only did you not stay in corporate, you also went back to China. And so would love to hear a little bit more about the thinking behind that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm a very first principles thinker. So when I was in Canada working, I think the great thing with consulting is it gives you like a 50,000 view. So I was kind of looking around, trying to figure out what industries make sense for me to go into after I finish consulting. And I kind of looked around me and figured like nothing really excited me. And I could see my life kind of flash before my eyes. Like I could see myself being 40 and 50 and retiring in Canada. And that was really scary to me. Like I felt like I was getting like a midlife crisis when I was just 20. So I wanted to do something different, and I gave myself 1 year. Yeah, very luckily, like a headhunter reached out from ByteDance, and they were hiring at the time and invited people to come to China. And at that time, I haven't spoken Chinese in like 15 years. Like I had very elementary school level Chinese, but I thought like just do it for 1 year, take this path. At worst, it's just a detour, but it could lead to something really exciting. You could not see your life flash before your eyes. So, yeah, that's kind of how I took the leap of faith. And then from there, I think it was like a slow process. Like I just loved being in China, and then I just kind of never left. And I think like looking back, I feel like the immigrant dream is actually just one about safety and stability most of the time. You're like there's a really steady path and you do the right thing. But I feel like I'm not really optimizing a life for me. And I kind of want to figure out through trusting my intuition and just my heart and just taking those leap of faith. I feel like has always led me to at the time it was scary, but a better or more exciting outcome.
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of people who have that experience probably feel similarly. And there is that idea of safety and stability that may make sense to parents, especially that may have come from a less stable background. And so, curious how that may have affected your own experience with your family, with your parents. What did going back to China teach you about your background, and what changed for you just in terms of your relationships in your life?
Yeah, I think my parents are not really the typical like Asian tiger parents where they want you to do the best. Like they had a very relaxed approach to growing up. Like they didn't really know what university major I majored in until I was almost graduating, and they're like, "Oh, you're doing business? I thought you were engineering." But they I think the thing is when you move to a new culture, especially like from east to west where the culture is so different, as a young kid, like I was 10 at the time, you're like shocked into a new system and in that new system, you have no status, you have nothing to grab onto, no community, or you're lucky if you already have like family or something living there. So you have to almost figure out what your relationship is to a completely new environment. And that often means, and I don't think it's a wrong thing, it's just part of survival, is that you have to abandon a lot of your old identity behind. So that's what happens a lot for immigrant kids. And there's also like the generational aspect as well as the cultural. Like it's even hard for American parents now to understand kids who are like Gen Alphas, right?
Right.
You don't really know what they're saying all the time. Yeah, so imagine there's that, like generationally, like we want to play Tamagotchi. That was like a cool thing, and my mom didn't really understand what that is. And then there's the cultural aspect as well. And I think the thing that really changed when I moved back to China is I realized my parents is not like I had a really hard time figuring out how they connected to my world because they felt like they were completely floating from everything else I knew in Canada, like my jobs and things like that. And then when I went back to China, I realized no, they're like a dot in like a massive pile of dots. They fit right into the system. And then by knowing where they fit in, I knew where I fit in, and I could see my lineage, and I could see my ancestors or my relatives and what their paths were, right? And I felt like I kind of knew what my history was, and then therefore I knew my identity better, and I felt more confident in myself. So yeah, I feel like it's more of a journey of self exploration and figuring out how you fit into the grand history of life. So that was really interesting to me, and I also became more understanding of the hard choices they made and the sacrifices they made, and just had a whole new sense of appreciation for what they did when they moved. Yeah.
Sure. I can imagine. I think part of growing up is understanding your parents as people a bit more, and especially if you go back to where they're from, if it's a very different place from where you had to grow up, it probably does put it into perspective. I guess switching to the search fund, how was that experience? How was raising the fund? How did you explain to investors that China actually could be a great market for search funds? What was that process like?
In terms of fundraising, I think there's the two sides. You have the international side, and then you have the local investors, and each side have different challenges, and it's common for emerging market searchers. On the international side, it's really the first problem, I think, is you have to find the right subset of investors who are risk on for emerging market search, because it's very easy for them to focus on North America as a geography or Europe as a geography, and China and Asia is very up and coming. It's a process of just figuring out like, hey, are you even interested in this market? That's one. And then second piece is getting them comfortable around the market risk, and that's doing some high level market research, figuring out what the bet is on the country, what are the opportunity sets. So that's kind of the narrative for international searchers. And I think the hardest part often for searchers is the local side. And it's, I think it still goes back to the cultural point because you're really trying to build a mental bridge between international definition of search and like what's reality on the ground with local investors. And in the case with China, local investors are very practical. They don't really care about MBA being passionate and trying the new thing. They kind of want to figure out, okay, like what's your thesis and what industry are you going to buy? So you have to be really fleshed out in your narrative for local investors. So yeah, I think for us, definitely the challenge was figuring out the local investor piece, and that's often the challenge for emerging market investor searchers. And then once you unlock local investors, usually the international investors will come on because they want to see that you have local market support. And typically, the international investors is relatively the same group of people that are risk on for emerging markets.
Sure. Yeah. That's what I've heard is that what's really essential if you're going to do an emerging market search fund is having enough local investors because it's going to be hard to convince the international ones not only to fund the search, but also the acquisition if there isn't enough support there. When it comes
Yeah, and
to,
I also feel like, sorry to cut you off, but I think the other piece is like, it's also the first, I guess, test that international investors do is like, how gritty can you be or like how entrepreneurial can you be to put together the local side of the cap table? Because you definitely face your first wave of rejections when you're fundraising on the local side. And a lot of times it's just like going through a long list of investors and you finally figure out a few and that works and a narrative that works for you. So yeah, that's I think a good way for international investors to engage as well.
Yeah, certainly. I think it definitely takes a lot more grit and entrepreneurial energy to be able to raise in an emerging market than in a place like the US where the system's already set up and you just go to the investors that everyone goes to. How was it explaining the model to local investors? Were they aware of search funds?
Yeah, I think on the investor side, it's a little different than brokers because for the investors, they have to buy into something, right? It's either the vision of search fund or it's they see themselves in you or they really like the deal that you bring them. For us, we found, and this is anecdotal, but a few of the searchers I talked to in emerging market all say that a lot of times it's just the searcher that compels like a local investor to invest. They don't really understand the search fund because it requires like multiple chain of logic reasoning and you have to buy into each chain to understand the entire model. So it's very hard for them to just get it. There are some first principles local investor, like there's one LP we have who does like secondary market investing, but because they just kind of understand value investing in general, they're like, yeah, this makes sense. Like Chinese, there's tons of like undervalued small SMEs that need succession. So they bought into that, but most are like, hey, I kind of see you in I see myself in you when I'm 20 years younger. And yeah, it's not that much money and it's an option, right? So it lets me see more deals. So we found that to be a pretty helpful narrative. And then on the broker side of things, it's different because for brokers, they kind of just need to know that you have fun and at least for us in China, they just want to understand, okay, like what kind of deals we want to see, what industries are we interested in. So we don't really need to explain search fund that much to the brokers.
It's really interesting. Have there been any other major surprises or cultural differences in the search process in China versus what's expected in the US?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of differences. I mean, culturally, I think it's really interesting that when you approach a Chinese seller, I think the way that search fund is taught in the US or North America as well as Europe is like, hey, you're not a PE, so don't pretend you're a PE. You're like a more approachable, friendly, more humanistic version of a PE. So you should approach with like a very personable, like motivational approach. Like I'm a young searcher. I'm really passionate about doing this. I'm not going to just be a PE and run over your company. I'm going to keep the employees. So we found that that narrative doesn't work that well with Chinese sellers. It can come off as more like a naivete almost. Like they don't really value passion and youth as much as like what can you what can you bring to my business? And it's an interesting exercise that they do, especially if it's like a cold, like a brokered outreach where they've never heard of you. It's like the first time they heard of search. They kind of like size you up a little bit, and they try to figure out like, hey, are you how much weight do you have, right? So if you come in with like a lot of youthful energy, then they kind of think you're small. So you kind of have to be more of like a PE. And because in China, like there's less PEs activities in general, especially on the buyout side, like it's not considered a bad thing for sellers to be interacting with the PE. Like they actually feel honored or they respect the other side to be more like throwing their weight. They almost want to have a deference to the investor. Yeah, so that's something we kind of learn over time, like culturally, like when you approach them or when you lead with like the narrative, like we focus more on like the investors we have, like the resources that we can bring to them, and yeah, we less on like our background and upbringing and motivation. That tends to be my experience.
It's super interesting. And I think it just goes to show that there's not one search fund playbook that works everywhere. You really need to figure out how the ecosystem is in each place. I guess the next question would just be how searching has gone for you so far. Did you have a thesis going in and has that evolved at all over time? Or is there anything that you learned from searching that changed the way you thought about business in China?
Yeah, the way we approached search was we had a pretty like industry agnostic search. So we focused on a few pillars, manufacturing being one of them, B2B services, and then franchise opportunities. So like pretty much like industry agnostic. Um, in terms of our approach, right now we're 3 months in. Most of the deals have been high quality ones have been through referrals or brokers, not much through proprietary outreach. So that's something we're, I guess, continuously try to experiment with. Like if that's a feature or a bug, I guess, like the internet speak, and how much of the intermediary relationship or network we should build out. Previously, I thought maybe we could do more cold outreach, but after doing a few, I think trust building in China is really focused on channel or referrals. So like who introduced you also carries a lot of weight. So I think it's a much easier exercise of credibility building if there's an intermediary or like someone that's like an agent of trust on both sides. So that's one thing that I think we're thinking through. And then in terms of industries, it hasn't changed that much. Manufacturing, at first, we were like the least happy with, or like the one that we expected from the least, because manufacturing is, in China, there's so much competition. But yeah, we actually found a few really interesting niche manufacturing deals with strong margins and just hidden champion type of deals. And it's like in industries you've never heard of before. So yeah, that's been really cool for us because you kind of do search and you believe in the model, but now you see tangible deals and you're like, oh yeah, I guess this actually, yeah, is real in the market.
Totally. When it becomes real, it's just a lot more exciting.
Right. Yeah.
Going to the point you made about how it is very relationship driven and referral driven, I was wondering how long does it actually take to build a real relationship that can help you in China? I know done some work in the Middle East, for example, where you have to have so many coffee meetings with the person to actually build a relationship where they trust you. I was wondering in China, is that an issue where it takes time, or is it more fast moving? Just knowing that you do have the 2 years to search, I'm just curious how the relationship driven aspect impacts things.
Yeah. Let me think of a quick way to answer this. I think in China it does take time, probably less time than the Middle East. But I, I'm, I haven't really worked there. I'm not sure, but I think in China the first meeting, it really depends on how you position yourself back again. Like you there's a way for you to kind of like as long as you know the code, right, of like the industry, you kind of understand the industry before you come in, so you're not just a blank sheet of paper. You understand the dynamics, you understand the struggle of the seller. They open up really easily. I had an experience where like I had a warm referral, so it was like a family friend that introduced us. And I went to this like 60-year-old founder's office, and it ultimately being a deal that didn't really. It's not a search asset, but it was still a really cool deal. They were doing ports, like deep sea water ports. And then it was the first meeting. We didn't sign any NDAs or anything. And then the owner just started pulling out all these contracts that he had and all these licenses, and like showing us all these cool licenses he had. And so it can really be immediately open, but it totally depends on like how you position yourself, who brought you in, what you're saying in the context of the meeting. And obviously there's an incentive piece of like they want to paint themselves in a good light. So the negative parts you kind of have to take time to figure out, and that requires you being like on site and talking to their employees and other people. So I think with the founder, a lot of times it's still like being that interpersonal piece. Like, can you like speak their language?
Sure. I think that's true of search anywhere, is that you do really need to see where things are not lining up, whether it's talking to the employee or the owner, and probably helps a lot to be able to have cultural knowledge, because if you're not from the culture, it may not be as obvious to you when the person's not telling you things. And so I think that is something to think about
Yeah,
if you're going to do search.
yeah. I think in Chinese there's a word called 自己人, which means one of us. So uh, you can there's so it's interesting because they actually view people that way where like he's one of us, they're not one of us, right? So how do you become one of us? And there's like a degree of one of us, and depending on like which region of China, like sometimes it's through drinking a lot, other times it's through playing cards and things like that. Where like if you're really trying to solve a problem that they have, like succession planning or transferring a company, then that process can become a lot quicker. And I think Liam has been super helpful because he's much more like aware of all the cultural context and nuances than I am. So a lot of times he also explains a lot of those nuances to me as well.
Really interesting. I guess maybe just one last question is, how has your international experience helped you or changed the way that you might be perceived in China when you do search?
Yeah, I think Chinese founders are very practical, and they always think about what do you bring to my business. So the international piece has been helpful because in the last few years, there's been a really strong interest in expanding abroad or overseas, and that's largely due to people realizing or like seeing from their peers that people have gone overseas really well, or like expanded international expansion have been pretty successful. And I don't mean exporting as just like a manufacturer. I mean like building a brand and actually creating a direct relationship with international customers. So yeah, that's a really straightforward narrative that we can say like we can help you with international expansion, have all these cultural nuances and understanding. And then the second piece is I guess less around international, but more around like us working consulting and then tech. And now we're also developing some thought leadership around AI with regards to how AI can be applied in traditional industries. So that's also a really natural fit because we may not be an expert in industrials manufacturing, but we can talk to you about like patterns that we're seeing in terms of AI adoption in traditional industries in North America and think about what are some ways to leverage that in China. So that's also been helpful in terms of brand building for us. And then on the operator side, it's been really helpful because in terms of hiring for interns and recruiting, that plays more of a brand role in attracting the talent and people that are curious about search. Right now, I think around like among university students, it's still maybe 1 out of 1,000 people have heard of it. So it's still a really new concept, but we have all the other HBS and all these other things that back up what this model is, and that's been helpful for attracting talent into working on this with us. So yeah, we've been really lucky to have a really good team that's really trying to figure out how this can work, and they're very entrepreneurial and very experimental. So yeah, and it's been a fun process to work on it with them.
Yeah, definitely. I think if someone's going to go in and expand search to the country, it needs to be probably someone like you and Liam that have that more respectable international background that can attract local talent who may not have heard of search funds. Just a quick follow up is, how has that been in terms of building a team, hiring people? Also, probably not exactly the same as it is in the US. So curious how your experience has been finding interns, finding those to work with you.
Honestly, it's been great. Not much to complain about. So also like a really China specific thing that I don't think exists in other market is like the power of Chinese social media. So there's a platform called Red Note. I think people in the West have starting to hear more about it. It's kind of like LinkedIn, Reddit, Instagram all in one, and it's known for having just like a really strong user generated content. Like the trust on that platform is unreal. Like if you see a post by someone, you kind of immediately believe that post. So that's been a really helpful engine for us actually for brand building and attracting talent. Like we just post like we're hiring, this is who we are, this is our LP base, this is the kind of work we want to do. And yeah, we've received a lot of talent through there. And there's all these like little consulting firms to help students land jobs that reposted our post. So now we just see our posts everywhere, and people have been just emailing us with their resumes. I think the job market in China right now is much more on the employer side. So I think a lot of university students are also just really curious or open to exploring like all these different options. I think in China, there's among young people, there's more of a general acceptance that things are going to change in the next 5 years. Like they think it's going to change in the next 3 to 5 years with AI. Yeah, I feel like in the US, people are still like, oh, maybe things will change, but like let's hold on to the status quo. But like in China, people there's a new term called one PC, like one person company that the government is really pushing, which is you can just start a company of your own, and they're expediting a lot of the bureaucratic process for those. So yeah, a lot of university students are really thinking about like, what do I want to do after I graduate? I kind of don't want to go into a corporate job if AI is really coming to eat the world. I find a lot of them thinking about entrepreneurship pretty seriously and exploring like alternative paths. So search fund is a pretty natural extension of that as well.
Yeah, certainly seems to be a lot more forward looking over there, but this is very, very interesting. Thank you so much for joining, Sally. This was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I really enjoyed speaking with you as well.